There comes a moment in a long life when you realize that what everyone calls practical is sometimes just fear dressed up in sensible clothing. I am 81 years old. My name is Harold. And not too long ago, my daughter sat across from me at this very table with a seriousness in her eyes I had never seen before. She spoke gently, carefully, as if choosing each word might soften the blow, and she told me it was time to start thinking about next steps. That phrase, so polite, so tidy, yet underneath it carried something final, something that felt like being quietly pushed toward the edge of a life I was not finished living. I had just come home from the hospital after a fall on the back steps. Nothing dramatic, just a cracked rib and a bruised hip. But at my age, those things echo louder than they should. They linger, not just in the body, but in the minds of the people who love you. My daughter had printed out pages, neat stacks of information about assisted living, care facilities, places with soft lighting and cheerful descriptions. She spoke about safety, about support, about not being alone. I heard something else entirely. I heard surrender. I remember looking around my kitchen while she talked, the same cabinets I had installed myself 40 years ago, the scratch on the table from when my wife dropped a pan one Christmas morning, the window where the light comes in just right in the afternoons. These weren't just objects. They were the evidence of a life lived, decisions made, days survived, and she was asking me, kindly but firmly, to consider leaving it behind. After she left that afternoon, I didn't move for a long time. I sat there with the papers in front of me, staring at photographs of smiling older people who didn't look like they were waiting for anything to end. But I knew better. I had visited a place like that once, years ago, when an old friend of mine was moved into one. I still remember the smell, the quiet, the way time seemed to stretch and thin out until it barely existed. He had looked at me like he was already halfway gone. I couldn't accept that future. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The next morning, I started making calls. Not because I had a clear plan, but because doing nothing felt like agreeing with everyone else. I called my younger brother first. He's always been the practical one, the kind who plans ahead and doesn't get caught off guard. I told him everything about the fall, about the conversation, about the pressure I felt creeping in from all sides. He listened, and when I finished, there was a pause that stretched longer than I liked. He finally said, "You might not have a choice forever, you know." That word again, choice, or the lack of it. But then he added almost reluctantly, "Still, you've never been the type to just go along with things." That stuck with me. It wasn't encouragement exactly, but it was enough to keep me from giving in too quickly. Over the next few days, I found myself asking questions everywhere I went. At the grocery store, at the pharmacy, even at the park bench where I sometimes sit in the mornings. Most people didn't have answers. They repeated the same things my daughter had said: safety, care, inevitability. But one afternoon, while waiting in line at the hardware store, a man I barely knew overheard me talking and leaned in. "My sister didn't go to one of those places," he said. That got my attention. He told me about a small house not far from here where a handful of older folks lived together. Not a facility, not something run by a big company, just a home with a caregiver who stayed there too. He described shared meals, quiet routines, people who knew each other's names. It sounded different. Not perfect, but human. I visited a week later. The house looked like any other on the street. No signs, no big entrance, no sense of being set apart from the world. Inside there were worn chairs, books stacked on tables, a television playing softly in the corner. Someone laughed from another room. A real laugh, not forced or polite. It felt alive in a way I hadn't expected. For a moment, I thought maybe this was the answer. Maybe this was the compromise that wouldn't feel like defeat. But as I stood in one of the bedrooms, looking at the neatly made bed and the small dresser beside it, something tightened in my chest. It was nice, it was kind, but it wasn't mine. And that mattered more than I could explain. So I kept searching. Late one night, unable to sleep, I found myself reading about communities where older people live near each other by choice. Not institutions, but neighborhoods designed for connection. People with their own spaces, their own routines, but with shared meals, shared responsibilities, shared lives. It sounded almost ideal, like something built for people who weren't ready to disappear quietly. For a few days, I let myself imagine it. A new place, new faces, a fresh start, even at my age. But the reality settled in quickly. The cost was high, more than I was comfortable spending. And the idea of leaving this town, this house, everything familiar felt like cutting away too much of myself all at once. I realized then that what I was really searching for wasn't just a place. It was a way to stay who I was. It took a little longer, but eventually I found something that felt closer to that truth. Not a place at all, but a network, a group of people who lived in their own homes but helped each other when needed. Rides to appointments, help with errands, small repairs, companionship, nothing overwhelming, nothing that took away independence. Just enough support to make staying possible. I joined quietly, without telling my daughter at first. Part of me wanted to see if it was real before I offered it as an alternative. The first few weeks, I didn't use it much. Old habits are hard to break, especially the habit of not wanting to be a burden. But then one morning, I needed a ride to a follow-up appointment, and I made the call. A man showed up right on time, cheerful, easygoing. We talked the whole way there about nothing important and everything at the same time. When he dropped me off, he said, "That's what we're here for." Something shifted in me that day. It wasn't just about getting help. It was about realizing I wasn't alone unless I chose to be. Over time, I started participating more, attending small gatherings, helping where I could, even if it was just making phone calls or checking in on someone else. And slowly, without making a big announcement about it, I built something that felt like a safety net. Not one imposed on me, but one I chose. When I finally sat down with my daughter again, I showed her everything. Not as an argument, but as a plan. A real one. Something thoughtful, something intentional. She listened. Really listened this time. And I could see the worry in her face begin to soften. "I didn't know this existed," she admitted. "Most people don't. And that's the part that troubles me the most. Not the aging, not the uncertainty, but the assumption that there is only one path. That once you reach a certain age, your choices narrow until they disappear entirely. They don't. Not completely. What I've learned at 81 is that there is no perfect answer. Every option asks something of you. Some ask for your home, some for your money, some for your comfort with change. There is always a trade-off, but there is also always, if you look hard enough, a measure of control. For me, that control means staying here, in this house, with its creaks and memories and familiar light. It means accepting help when I need it and offering what I can when I'm able. It means living with a little uncertainty instead of surrendering to a certainty I don't want. I still get scared sometimes. I still think about what might happen if things change too quickly, if my body stops cooperating in ways I can't manage. But fear, I've realized, isn't a reason to give up. It's a reason to pay attention, to adapt, to keep choosing. Because as long as I'm choosing, I'm still living. And that, more than anything, is what I refuse to give away. There's a particular kind of regret that doesn't arrive all at once. It seeps in slowly, quietly, like a draft under a door you didn't realize was open. I am 86 now. My name is Evelyn, and if you had asked me 10 years ago what I feared most about growing older, I would have given you a very sensible answer. Losing my health, perhaps, becoming a burden. The usual things people say when they haven't yet stood at the edge of a decision that changes everything. What I didn't understand then was how easy it is to mistake urgency for truth. How quickly love, fear, and exhaustion can push you into a choice that feels reasonable in the moment but lingers in your bones long after. It started after my second fall. The first one we all dismissed. I laughed it off, told my son it was just carelessness, that I had tripped over nothing more than my own stubbornness. But the second one came only months later, and this time I couldn't get up on my own. I remember lying there on the floor, staring at the ceiling, feeling something deeper than pain settle inside me. Not helplessness exactly, but a crack in the certainty I had always carried. By the time I was back home, my children had already begun discussing options. They didn't say it in front of me at first. They thought I couldn't hear the quiet conversations in the next room, the way voices lower when people think they're protecting you. But I heard enough to know they were afraid. And when people are afraid, they look for the fastest way to make that feeling go away. For them, that way was a facility, a good one, they assured me. Clean, well-reviewed, close enough for visits. They showed me brochures, just like my son had years ago when we were choosing a retirement plan for his father. Back then it had all felt theoretical, distant. Now it was being placed directly in front of me, wrapped in concern and practicality. I didn't fight them the way I might have when I was younger. That's the truth I have to live with. I was tired, not just physically, but in a way that made decisions feel heavier than they should have. I told myself they knew best, that maybe this was simply the next chapter, the natural progression everyone talks about. So I agreed. The day I left my house is not something I like to dwell on, but it comes back to me anyway. The quiet way the door closed behind me. The glance I took at the living room, trying to fix it in my memory as something permanent, even as I was leaving it behind. I told myself it was just a place, that I would adjust, that people do this every day and find a way to be content. The first week wasn't terrible. That's how these things begin. Everyone is kind. There are smiles, introductions, schedules explained with reassuring voices. You are guided, gently but firmly, into a routine that is meant to make everything easier. But what I began to notice little by little was how much of myself was no longer necessary. Meals came whether I was hungry or not. Lights were turned off at times that suited the building, not me. Conversations were polite, often kind, but rarely personal. It was as if I had been placed into a system that functioned perfectly well without needing to know who I really was. And that is where the regret began. Not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet question that surfaced when I lay in bed at night. Was there another way? Had I looked hard enough? Or had I accepted the first answer because it was easier for everyone else? I started paying attention then, watching the other residents, listening to their stories when they chose to share them. Some were content truly. They had reached a place where the trade-off felt fair. But others carried that same quiet question I felt inside myself. One afternoon, I met a woman named Lillian in the common room. She was sharp, observant, the kind of person who notices things others overlook. We spoke often after that, and one day she said something that stayed with me. I didn't know there were other options until it was too late to choose them, she said. That sentence settled heavily in my chest. Too late. I began asking questions, gently at first, not to challenge my children, not yet, but to understand. I spoke to staff, to visitors, to anyone who might know something beyond these walls, and slowly pieces of information began to surface. A man mentioned his sister lived in a small shared home, not unlike a regular house. A volunteer spoke about community groups that helped older people stay where they were. Someone else described neighbors who organized support for each other, quietly, without any formal system at all. Each story felt like a thread, and I began to realize there was a whole fabric of possibilities I had never seen. The hardest part wasn't discovering these things. It was accepting that I hadn't searched for them when I still had the chance. That is the kind of realization that sits with you. Not to punish, but to remind. I don't blame my children. I want to be clear about that. They acted out of love, out of fear, out of a desire to keep me safe. But safety, I have learned, is not the only measure of a life. There is also dignity, identity, the quiet sense of belonging to your own days. And those things require intention. They require questions. Sometimes they require resistance. If I could speak to the version of myself from that time, the woman sitting at her kitchen table feeling tired and overwhelmed, I would tell her this: do not rush. Do not let urgency make the decision for you. Ask more questions than feel comfortable. Look beyond what is handed to you, because once you step into a path like this, it becomes much harder to step back out. I have made peace with where I am now. Not the kind of peace that comes from satisfaction, but the kind that comes from understanding. I participate where I can. I build small connections. I hold on to the parts of myself that remain fully mine. But there is a difference between adapting and choosing. And if there is one thing I have learned, one thing I wish more people understood before they reach this point, it is that the mistake is rarely in needing help. The mistake is in believing there is only one way to receive it. I am 89 years old now. My name is Thomas. And when you live this long, you begin to understand that life does not hand you clean conclusions. It gives you fragments, moments, choices that echo long after they are made. And if you are fortunate, if you are stubborn enough, you get the chance to make sense of those echoes before everything goes quiet. I spent most of my life believing in preparation. I was an engineer, the kind of man who trusted plans, measurements, predictable outcomes. If something could go wrong, you accounted for it. If a system failed, you redesigned it. I carried that thinking into my later years, convinced that aging could be managed the same way. That if I made the right arrangements early enough, I could avoid the chaos I had seen in others. So I planned. I downsized before anyone asked me to. Sold the larger house after my wife passed, moved into a smaller place closer to town. I organized my finances, labeled documents, made lists for my children so they would never have to guess. And when the topic of future care came up, I approached it the same way I approached everything else, logically. I toured facilities, good ones, that's what I told myself. Clean, efficient, well-reviewed. I walked through quiet hallways, listened to administrators explain their systems, their staffing ratios, their safety protocols. It all made sense. It was all very reasonable. I told my son, when the time comes, this is where I'll go. No confusion, no scrambling. At the time, I felt a strange kind of pride. I believed I was sparing my family from difficult decisions. I believed I was taking control. What I didn't realize was that I was defining my future too narrowly, mistaking the most visible option for the only one worth considering. Years passed. I managed well on my own, better than expected. I kept my routines, my independence, my quiet way of living. But time has a way of shifting things slowly at first, then all at once. A fall, an illness, a recovery that doesn't quite return you to where you were before. And suddenly the plans you made in theory begin to feel very real. My son reminded me of what I had said about being prepared, about not wanting to complicate things, and I agreed. That is the part that still lingers with me, not because it was forced, but because it wasn't. I walked into that decision believing I had already made it years ago, believing I was simply following through on a plan. The place was exactly as I remembered, efficient, organized, safe, and yet within weeks I felt something I had not accounted for. Absence, not of people, not of care, but of something harder to name. The absence of choice in small things. When to wake, when to eat, when to step outside. The absence of being needed, of contributing in ways that felt natural rather than assigned. I had designed a solution for a problem, but I had not asked the right question, not how will I be cared for, but how will I live? That difference is everything. It took time for me to understand that my mistake wasn't in planning. Planning is not the enemy. The mistake was in limiting my imagination, in accepting a single model without exploring what else might exist beyond it. I began slowly to look outward again, to listen more carefully, to notice conversations I might have ignored before. A staff member mentioning her grandmother who lived with a small group in a shared home. A visitor talking about neighbors who organized support for one another. Small details, easily dismissed if you are not paying attention. But I was paying attention now, and what I began to see was not a single alternative, but a landscape of possibilities. None perfect, none without compromise, but each offering something different. Different balances between independence and support, between familiarity and change. I spoke to my son about it one afternoon, not with anger, not with regret directed at him, but with clarity I hadn't had before. I told him I had been wrong to think there was only one path worth preparing for. He listened quietly at first, then with growing understanding. I thought we were doing what you wanted, he said. We were, I told him, but I didn't know enough to want something better. That is a difficult thing to admit at any age, but especially at mine. To acknowledge that even a lifetime of experience does not guarantee wisdom in every corner of your life. In time, we made changes, not dramatic ones, not a complete reversal, but adjustments that brought pieces of my life back into alignment with who I still was. More time outside, more involvement in decisions about my own routine, more connection with people who saw me as something other than a resident. And through all of it, a different kind of understanding began to settle in. There is no perfect ending, no arrangement that preserves everything exactly as it was. Aging asks something of you always. It asks you to let go of certain abilities, certain certainties, but it does not require you to surrender your identity. That part, I have learned, must be protected deliberately. If you do not ask questions, others will answer them for you. If you do not define what matters, it will be defined on your behalf. And if you accept the first solution presented to you without looking further, you may find yourself living inside a life that fits on paper but not in your heart. I do not speak from bitterness. That is important to say. My life, even now, is not without moments of quiet satisfaction, a conversation that lingers, a memory that surfaces at the right time, the simple act of sitting in sunlight and feeling, for a moment, entirely present. but I also carry the awareness of what I did not see sooner. And so, if there is anything worth leaving behind in words, anything that might reach someone standing at the beginning of this same road, it is this: do not confuse preparation with limitation. Do not let fear, even well-meaning fear, narrow your vision. There are more ways to live than most people are told, more paths than the obvious ones. Some require effort to find, some require courage to choose, but they exist. And your life, no matter your age, is still yours to shape within those possibilities. Even now, at 89, I feel that truth in small but steady ways, in the choices I insist on making, in the conversations I choose to have, in the quiet refusal to become only what is expected of me. Because the end of a life is not defined by where you are placed. It is defined by how much of yourself you carry with you, all the way through. And I intend to carry as much as I can.